Thanks. And I'd also like to pay my respects to Uncle Col and the Yorta people, and thank you for your generous welcome. I first went fishing as a young kid growing up in Frankston. Our neighbour Don had a small, beautiful wooden boat that he'd built himself, and on very calm days he would take my dad, my brother and I out to a spot triangulated by the Frankston and Seaford piers. If you can imagine, look, you can see both down straight down both piers. We'd drop bait over the side of his boat and wait. And I'll never forget that first fish, a flathead, that hit that hook, and I pulled it up, terrified I was going to lose it, but got it into the boat, and just the sheer joy of landing that first fish set me on a journey. And I'm sure you all know that thrill, and you've all had your own journey of loving from that first fish to grow to love fishing, and that's brought you here indeed today. I first started chasing freshwater natives back in the 2000s with a bunch of friends that I'd met at work. We'd go up to the Murray, we'd get whatever bait we could find, barty grubs, scrubbies, yabbies, and we'd sit in our tinny and we'd throw out lines and share stories and maybe have a couple of beers and usually get some success. One day around 2008, one of those mates, Tom, suggested we try lure fishing. There were about 8 of us going up on the next trip, and 3 of us agreed to try lure fishing with him, and the other 4 said that they'd stick with the bait. So we set up a lure boat and a bait boat, and out we went. Now, there'd been a bit of rain in the days leading up to that trip, and the water was pretty muddy. We had a few little hard body lures, even a couple of spinner baits, which to my untrained eye looked like a ridiculous contraption to try and catch a fish with. Before too long, there was a call from the bait boat. "I'm on." "Great," we said over on the lure boat and kept casting. Then again, "Got one," bait boat. "Get the net," bait boat. Another bait boat. You may have heard the cry, "Round the boat." Well, on this trip it was round the boats, and the happy quartet on the bait boat chortled as they reeled off their impressive catch numbers. While over on the lure boat, things were starting to get grim. Snags, treble trouble, lost lures, no fish. The silence was ominous. You could have cut the air with a filleting knife, and that was about all you could cut because there were no fish. The next trip, there were 2 bait boats. And over the next decade, we had some great fishing trips and caught some great fish, all on bait. I had the great pleasure of being with my kids when they both caught their first fish. It's my daughter there, a Murray cod, both of them Murray cod. She called it a mummy cod, but it was terrific fun. And we had a lot of fun and a lot of fish, all caught on bait. I had some success in clear water with lures, so catching trout on rapalas, flatties and brim on soft plastics, a few reddies in lakes as well. And that was all good fun, but didn't get back to lures for the natives, and I think still scarred from that trip. Cut forward to the 2018 Murray Codference. Some 10 years after that fateful trip to Kundrook, Anthony Forster had invited Gus Deere, Craig Ingram and myself to join him at the Goulburn in a favourite spot of his north of Nagambie on the Saturday prior to the 2018 Codference to go lure fishing. A little nervously, but safely assured that there were no bait fishers coming with us to round the boats at me, I agreed to come along. Gus lent me a rigged up cod rod and we set off. Craig headed off in a small kayak and caught a couple of nice fish. Gus, Anthony and I walked the bank. Gus caught a lovely trout cod on the surface, and the amazing sound of that fish breaking the surface and taking that lure stays with me to this day. And Anthony got a lovely Murray cod on a spinnerbait, if I recall correctly. I tried a spinnerbait at first, and then a stump jumper, and then back on a spinnerbait, and I saw this big white set of cod lips come up after that spinnerbait along the snag and then turn away at the last minute. So there was no fish for me that day, but there was a follow and that was enough to give me a glimmer of hope. The next day found us at Codference. Among the many great speakers, Yorick Piper wowed us with pictures of big cod and cautionary advice about water clarity and time management. Carl Jochimsen dazzled us with stories of big bass fishing and how like cod fishing it was, and talked up some pretty flashy gear. But the speech that had the biggest impact on me was from Women in Recreational Fishing Ambassador Karen Reeves, and it was a speech about how hard it was to catch her first cod on a lure, how she almost gave up, how she almost gave up, and how one night in 2014 changed her fishing life as she landed her first Murray cod on a surface lure. I was hooked, and I was on a mission from that point to catch a cod on a lure. Now, two of my mates from the lure boat on that fateful trip 10 years earlier had moved overseas, but the other one was still around and also at that conference, and who many of you would know, Travis Dowling, who's now the CEO of the VFA. He too had still never caught a cod on a lure, which was pretty embarrassing for someone in his position. So he signed up on that mission as well, and a new chapter in our fishing began. But it was not to prove easy. My next stop was up at Trellies in Shepparton a few days later to pick up a Miller rod, a Corrado reel, and to begin to assemble the arsenal of lures that I might need for the task. I can assure you there's no truth to the rumour that that trip to Trellies led to his decision to open a store in Bendigo to be closer to a lucrative new market. And while it is true I did get some nice gear, it's also perfectly fine to chase cod on average or ordinary gear, as Travis's setup could attest. And we started going fishing, and fishing, and fishing. As the great fishing legend Bushy opined at our Dusky Flathead Symposium a few years back, the people who catch fish are the people who go fishing. So whenever Trav and I could sneak away for an overnighter or even just a few hours on the river, we did, and we caught no fish. I got a good cod hook sometime. We fished all summer. Anthony came with us once. He caught a fish. Trav got a follow, but we didn't catch a fish. I got a good cod hook sometime, I reckon, early autumn. We reckoned about 80 centimetres, got it right in next to the boat, and it performed a barrel roll a Spitfire pilot would be proud of, and just sort of swam away. You could have heard a pin drop, and what you would have heard next does not bear repeating. As the weather started to cool, we started to get a little despondent. Just when you think it isn't going to happen, it doesn't happen, I remember Trav saying one day. We decided on one last trip in April before it got too cool for us. We were a bit soft then and we didn't know much about all those big cod in winter. And a lot of the smaller cod seemed to switch off in the colder months, we'd heard. So we went on that last trip and we fished all morning, and then we fished all afternoon, and we went further down the river than we'd ever gone before, up to the top end of Arcadia, knowing it was likely to be our last shot for a few months. And we decided, as we were about to head back, to go one last bend, and we found some pretty fishy looking water. Just with a lovely big bank, lots of structure, and yes, sweet, sweet success. I caught a cod on a lure, and it was magnificent. It was like that first flathead back in the bay as a boy. And we took a photo, let it go, cracked a beer, and headed back upstream. And eventually, even though it took a few more months, Trav caught a cod too. And from there, we caught more fish. It was like we turned on a tap, except we hadn't. Through all those months of getting follows but not hits, hits but not hookups, of listening to the experts, of watching our more experienced friends catching fish while we weren't, we were learning how to cast to snags and shadows, learning thumb control on our bait casters, learning to slow our retrieve, and when you think it's slow enough, to go even slower, trying to fathom the unfathomable bite window. and learning that for some reason, cod on the Goulburn just love purple spinnerbaits with lots of blingy metal, even though they look nothing like absolutely anything you would ever imagine them eating. As Lubin and Karen both said back in 2018, never give up. We didn't, and now, on most trips, we catch cod on lures. And it's always a thrill, but the journey isn't over. Because we've just started catching cod on surface lures. And just like that first boof I heard back in 2018 when Gus got that trout cod, the explosive displacement and the sound of a cod taking a surface lure is exhilarating and addictive. The first one I caught on a surface just a few weeks back was right next to the boat. I thought the retrieve was done and I was about to pull the lure out of the water, and the sudden attack on the lure was so massive I almost dropped the rod and fell into the river. It was only 55 centimetres. I listened very closely to Cameron McGregor this morning talking about catching big cod, because I want to see that with a big fish. I want to hear and feel that with a metre plus fish. And even though I can't wait for it to happen, I just know that I have to keep fishing to get there. So to all my old bait fishing mates, I've got one last thing to say. Round the boats. Thanks.